My name is Marc Fontrier. I am a retired officer and a doctor in African geopolitics. I have lived 27 years in Africa and a few years in Somalia, particularly during the deployment of operations by the United Nations and of Operation ARESAE previously. I was leading the French intelligence during the operation. I'll be talking to you about Al-Shabaab, who is often making big headlines. They're not a model for Islamist movements if I compare them to what exists elsewhere in the world. But they've had a very specific development which wasn't set in the few years preceding their appearance. Al-Shabaab is indeed an Islamist movement following a radical Islam. They are situated in Somalia, but they are the consequence of 40 years, or maybe 50 years now, of the infiltration of a radical Islam within the Somali population. First of all, Somalis, as I think Gérard Cognier has talked to you brilliantly about, are a large range of lineages. It is not necessary right now to go in further detail about that range. It is simply needed to keep in mind that they are a society which is traditionally acephalous and segmental, and thus struggles to find coherence through an organized nation-state system, such as the West has imposed upon the rest of the world for the last 50 years. There is a range of lineages, which means from a common ancestor, a sum of grandsons and great-grandsons started families and each time created social segments. Those social segments gained their autonomy. They became individual, to the point where in the Somali society, everything starts from the base. When the Westerners introduced Somalia and Somalis, they introduced a lineage range with great pyramids of lineage. What's important to know, especially for someone who wants to take action in the field, is that any Somali issue is built from the individual. And from this individual, it will get transmitted in an agnatic rationale to the parents to build from there. There's no order that comes from the top. That doesn't exist. The Somali world, you can see it on the lineage pyramid. I won't insist further. There's something else that drives it, what Somalis call khair. Khair is the traditional law, the law of the clan. It is not a law as we understand it. It is a kind of modus vivendi, a practice accepted by all, in which some authorities will manifest themselves, not by their power to enforce, but by their capacity to advise. In the Somali world, any situation will be the result of a consensus, which means that everything is very long. It is not unique in Africa, nor is it unique in the Near and Middle East, but it is particularly pronounced in the Somali society. The moral authority, more on that later, belongs to, I call it the authority for it has to be called something. It belongs to a number of people which we will see later. The decision process is always the same, the consensus. You can't exit a meeting with an individual who's told you he would do something, thinking that he would do it. No. He has to refer to the clan first or to the family, depending on the scale adopted. You cannot expect anything on the decision level immediately after a meeting. It's not like our society. It's the opposite of the Germanic principle, if you will, where if you have a meeting, everything is already prearranged. It's not like that at all. It will be necessary to make some decisions. So the consensus is very difficult for people who have central units in Europe and a deployment occurring in the field, because in the field, everyone is putting pressure on you when it doesn't go fast enough. It is true for big administration, is true for companies, and so on and so forth. Kabyle in Somali is an Arabic word used to name the tribe. Those are drawings circulating in media, newspaper in Mogadishu, which are sensitive to the issue while still maintaining a feeling of powerlessness regarding the preeminence of the clan. The Somali decisional model, 3 levels. First, Odai, which translates to the elder. His power is not decisional, but it is the power to gather around him all the people once they agree. They are, in a way, the end of the conversation. The conversation is led by the collectivity around the tree, which has a symbolic value. And once everyone agrees, having expressed themselves, for everyone is entitled to speak, the youth, the elders, everyone, then a consensus appears or it doesn't appear, and as long as it doesn't, there will be no decision. Hence the failure of all reconciliation conferences that have taken place since 91. As long as a consensus doesn't appear, nothing will happen. The second individual is the Wadad, the one who knows what the Quran says. The Wadad doesn't have a decisional function either. From time to time, they will turn to him and he'll say, here's what the religion say. Here is what the scriptures say. And the third level is the warriors, the one who will possibly enforce what has been decided by consensus within the Somali society. That is the logic. This is the traditional rationale. Then we have to understand, in the traditional society, there's a saying that goes, if you have to choose between the law of the religion, the Sharia, and the law of the clan, the Khair, choose the law of the clan. This is the traditional position of the Somali sphere, and it is always true. Now, other things have happened with the independencies, with the colonization, etc. At the time of the independencies, the colonizers, whether Italian or English, tried to train the leaders of the future nation, especially since it seemed that they had decided to unite the two areas, English Somaliland and Italian Somalia. When they had to train these people, the English sent them to London, to English universities, which trained the leaders of Somaliland, and the Italians to Rome or elsewhere. Then everyone decided to send people to Cairo, to the Al-Azhar University, to Medina or the Mecca in Saudi Arabia, to train according to the Muslim law, which, as it was understood, was going to be the core aspect of the laws chosen for the new state. However, at Al-Azhar University, they were in contact with 2 types of government, 2 ways to see the world. The way of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a radical way, much less at the beginning when it was created in 1929 by Hassan al-Banna than it became during the 50s and 60s, with a much tougher trend under the philosophy of Sayyid Qutb, who was executed by Nasser. So this is what they learn at Al-Azhar. They learn a much more radical Islam, and above all, a political Islam, which does not exist at all in traditional Somali psychology. Islam is not political. They will also experience something else at Al-Azhar. They'll meet Egyptians who weren't necessarily Muslims. They'll meet the world of Nasser, which is a progressive, materialistic vision of society. And they'll bring back ideas that are not Muslim ideas, but Marxist communist ideas. Those who go to Mecca or Medina don't have that issue. Everyone is trained according to the Wahhabi Islam, which is a very radical Islam, with a very tough stance on law. And that Islam is the law in Saudi Arabia. In consequence, a group of people would come back to Mogadishu and other big cities in Somalia with those ideas. Those ideas won't stand out immediately. The First Republic took place without fuss, under the aegis of the former colonizer, especially the Italians, but also the English in Somaliland, until the putsch in 1970, 10 years after, when Siad Barre took power. When Siad took power, the Islamist world wasn't there. It was not at the forefront. It hasn't manifested itself yet. But all those people who went to Al-Azhar, to Mecca and to Medina, they're professors who have been trained according to the rules of Islam, and they're going to disseminate a certain vision of Islam different from traditional Islam to their students. Under Siad, the trend doesn't go in their direction, that's for sure. Siad, as we were discussing earlier, is someone who did very good things at first, and then was the victim of bad luck. The drought, the Ugandan war that he failed to win, his own mistakes, and most of all the fact that his country entered a civil war, and that he himself had a drift towards clans, something that he had avoided before. Because the first idea of Siad Barre was to set up a communist or Marxist state. In 1973, he was faced, particularly when he created a family law, giving equality to women regarding inheritances, and so on and so forth. He took 10 wadad, or wadado in plural, preachers in the mosques of Mogadishu who are radicals and who thought that it was the right time to put forward their Islam, and then he put them against a wall and executed 10 of them by shooting in the middle of Mogadishu so that the world could see. At that moment, radical Islam goes back under the radar. The Muslim world has time. The issue for Muslims are not the same as ours. If he doesn't get to see the appearance of God's law on this earth, it will be for his children or his grandchildren. There's no hurry, so they wait. So then we're faced with two kinds of Islam in a way, what they call radical Islams. An Islam which will choose, I have to simplify tremendously, but we have to start from those fundamentals. An Islam which will work through persuasion, what we call dawah, the invitation, to commit to Muslim ideas and to the Muslim law. And the second way, which is much more radical, coming from the Muslim Brotherhood's evolution, it's what you know under the word jihad, which doesn't mean war or holy war, but rather effort. And a variation of it, a possibility, is war, the imposition. Since in the Muslim world you have the country of war and the country of Islam. So you have this proselyte will and a proselyte desire. So traditional Sunni Islam, what is it? It's an Islam that corresponds to a particular school of law, the Shafi'i madhab, which prevails in almost all the Indian Ocean basin. Islamic law, as you know, is based on the Quran, of course, on a corpus of tradition, the Hadith, and on a number of behaviors when neither allows to find the solution to a legal issue at a given moment. This school, all four Sunni schools of law appeared around the same time, around 700, 850. In that region, it is this Islam which is in the strictest being the Hanbali school from Saudi Arabia, nor is it the most lenient being the Maliki school, followed in North Africa especially. Another characteristic of the Somalian Islam is the allegiance to brotherhoods, especially in the interfluve, where I think you are deployed or considering to be deployed, between the Chablais River and the Juba River. The brotherhoods are deeply rooted there. They've always been. They had some tense periods, but they were always, in a way, and still are, as they are in Senegal or elsewhere, factors of appeasement. They create what lacks in Sunni Islam, which is a spiritual direction. They can say, all right, let's all calm down now. Anyone can make their own interpretation of Islam based on the sacred scriptures, since there is no clergy unlike in Shia Islam. So as I said, when students form contact while training in Cairo or in Saudi Arabia, but also when they come back, circles of people and small organizations are created. Those new ideas face structural opposition, a new political confrontation, because we have a democratic, liberal, Western type principle when we deal with the Syrian version. I'll use this word to simplify things. And above all, atheism, which is completely senseless in the Muslim world. A new social religious confrontation. The new ideas call for an identification of the contradiction that exists between the concept of religious community and the concept of clan. And you can find that with the Shabaab at the present time. Solidarity within the clan prevails over faith. That's the rule I was telling you about earlier. Islam of the Brotherhood. So the new hypothesis. There is some kind of war going on in the mosques about the way to view all of that, and there are now some preachers who are much better trained in Muslim dialectic and who will be able to convince more people that their vision of Islam is the right one. As long as the country is at peace, there is no real issue, even though it's a precarious peace. But things are still going to change when the situation endangers the daily life of each Somalian. We've seen that. And we will see the appearance from the 60s in Somaliland of a movement called Al-Shabaab. And you can already anticipate the concept of youth and the concept of unity. The Somali language has adopted a lot of Arabic words that are written in Somali. In Arabic, you wouldn't say Al-Shabaab, but Al-Shabaab. In Mogadishu, you see the appearance of a movement, Al-Hali, which divides itself in two movements, the Salafiyya movement, those who claim to follow the living ways of the Prophet's time, and the Takfir. Those are the fearsome ones. They bring people to their very harsh vision of Islam that you can find in Somalia and also elsewhere in the world, of course. ISIS, for instance. There are people who consider that their way is the only one, and if you don't agree with them, it's unbearable to them. Not only do they think that any Muslim who doesn't follow them is an unbeliever, but even those who don't share their faith, the Western population notably. Those two movements ended up rejoining at some point, and will be created a third and a fourth movement, Al-Hurda, and then the Islamic Gathering, which will join the Somalians movement to create a movement much talked about around 1995, and which disappeared around 2004, Al-Iqrad al-Islam. A few historical landmarks. I'll go over that very quickly, not to waste any time. Please read that quickly. We must keep in mind that in 1991, the country was collapsing. There is no state structure, no law system, nothing at all. Moreover, there are some climate issues, which occur quite often in Somalia. So it's time for faction leaders. You might remember the presence of Ali Mahdi, who in a way stole the victory from General Aidid, who had a real political project. In 1991, the north part of the country decided to take its independence and its current Somaliland. 1994-1995, the United Nations operation took place. The infamous American subtlety leads to disaster, and we, the West, leave the country. Almost everyone, save for a few humanitarians, that stayed. In 1997, under the initiative of Lewis, the specialist, the creator of Somalian studies, we start to consider building blocks, which means, since we can't seem to stabilize the country, the idea is to exit from the areas more peaceful, to limit them, and give them the opportunity to rebuild themselves as peacefully as possible. That's what happened in Somaliland in a very natural manner. That's what happened in the northeast of the country. Some other tries happen all over the country. In 1998, Puntland declared its autonomy. In 2000, the president of Djibouti, who's just been elected, Ismail Omar Guelleh, thinks he has a diplomatic move to make, and he decides to have a conference to gather all the faction leaders. He didn't succeed, but he still managed to set up a system that allows a transition government to take place. However, this transition government brings back all the associates of Siad Barre who all come back from exile and who, for some of them, including the chosen president of this government, are former ministers. The president himself was a minister 4 or 5 times. That's the worst moment for the Americans. And it's a shame for the brave young men who lost their lives there. But it created a fracture between the American society and the Somali world. The Americans just came back from the Iraq War when we arrived in Somalia. It was a display of power. It was like the landing on the beach. All of a sudden, while they had just defeated hands down a great, organized, equipped army, there were a couple good-for-nothings armed with knives and old Kalashnikov, resisting them in the streets of Mogadishu and others. There, the fracture, a fracture for everyone. At this moment, the Islamist movement starts to develop in Somalia, of course, but also in Ethiopia's Ogaden, which is inhabited by Somalis. It's the Somali region of Ethiopia. The Islamists at that time will try to create an Islamic state. First in the north, at the border of Puntland and Somaliland, and also in the south of Somalia, in the ghetto. It's the region that is at the border with Kenya and Ethiopia. And it's the home of the Marehan clan. But immediately, everyone reacts. The Somalis themselves, Ethiopia doesn't want to see people having a shelter in Somalia while they're creating dissent in Ogaden, the Somali part of Ethiopia. All that leads to exploitation, and the survivors, who are crushing Islamists, spread all around but still there. Either they reposition themselves in business very easily, or they retrieved by the Aouye, a great confederation of lineage in Mogadishu, who are actually more than the Somalis. At that time, they developed some acquaintances with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means nothing and everything. It's a logo. In 2004, Al-Qaeda barely exists anymore. except to refer to a certain vision of Islam and of the Muslim's duty. But you must know that in 93, it's the time when Osama is kicked out of Sudan and has to go elsewhere. He goes to Afghanistan because in Afghanistan there's still a war, there are still fights, and those fights, at the time when Ziad's regime collapsed, at the time when nobody knew what to do after the Ogaden War, a group of people, young or not, answered Saudi Arabia's call for jihad in Afghanistan to fight. First, it was against the Russians in the 80s, and then it was against the Americans. So there was a call there, and the young people that didn't know what to do in Somalia, they left. Those of you who've read books on the issue can find those people. Al-Qaeda was the foundation for Osama. His work in Afghanistan was to gather and to arm all the foreign volunteers who arrived to fight. That's the real original foundation. In the 90s, he was there, and those people knew that they wouldn't last very long where they were, and that they needed a retreat option. Somalia was considered by Al-Qaeda as a possible retreat base because it's a state without law. There's nothing, there's no law. And it's in that state of immense disorder. I'll show it to you very quickly. That's how this radical Islam is built. This special group on the bottom right, that's going to be Al-Shabaab. This group of youth in the Islamic courts. How much time do I have left? Not long. Someone stole my time. 2000, the transition government. 2004, the federal government. In 2006, the Americans create, from the former war leaders that they fought against, an organization for the restoration of peace in Somalia. That's the name. Organization for the Restoration of Peace. This organization seems threatening to Islam, of course, but everyone saw that. Since for a while there was no laws and the government in place didn't govern anything but Mogadishu, the Muslim law was still the only thing left. It's a bit like in the north of Nigeria. If things are like this, it's because there was nothing else. It was the state failure. The state was still there in Nigeria, but here it had completely disappeared. And gradually in the neighborhoods of Mogadishu, courts are set up to serve justice. They put people in jail based on the Muslim law. They even create a militia to arrest thieves. They put in order the Marc Road, the South Gates, to fight against pirates, for instance. They do things like that in a more or less legal way, more or less benevolent way. There will always be someone who finds a way to put money in its own pocket, but overall it works well, and the Islamic courts reinstate order in Mogadishu. I went to Mogadishu at the time, and the streets were being swept. I had seen Mogadishu 10 years earlier. Underground cables were being dismantled and stolen. Those Islamic courts, there were 15 of them, which were established just like that, according to the tribes, the clans, because they all have a clan relevance. And among them, some are tough and some are moderate. The tough ones are rather the men on the top. And the moderate ones are the men on the bottom. In 2006, those courts are rather successful. And they have the opposition against the American going on for them. The war begins. It's the American-Ethiopian operation, or Ethiopian-American if you'd like, at that moment. The courts are then overwhelmed. The Islamists were unwise. There are too many foreign fighters among them. The population knows that and supports them half-heartedly. And most of all, the American strike force and the Ethiopian strike force arrives and overpowers them completely. The Islamists had no better choice, no other choice, but to take refuge in the south of the country or abroad, where they tried to rebuild themselves. The courts had rapidly conquered the territory, with, as I said, a police to take over of Mogadishu by the courts in June of 2006. But after the Ethiopian reaction, they are unable to fight back, and the tough courts take refuge in the south of the country. That's Al-Shabaab. The others leave for Eritrea, which was at war with Ethiopia in the 2000s. Eritrea, friends of my friends are my friends, but enemies of my enemies are my friends too. Eritrea supports Al-Shabaab, although they never admit it. So you find Al-Shabaab in the south. Awai and Sharif were friends for a very long time, but no more. Once they went to Asmara to take refuge, they'll fight. The first, the tender one, will try to make do with the transition governments that take place, and the other decides to continue the fight against the Americans, of course, and the Ethiopians, but also against the government that they support. In 2009, the Alliance for the Liberation explodes. Sheikh Hamed goes to Djibouti, and Hassan Dahir Wise goes to Asmara. Meanwhile, Sharif is elected president of the Republic in 2009 because the former president resigned for medical reasons, president of the Ghost Transition Government. At that moment in Somalia, a real radical trend is established. It's the moment when Al-Shabaab is able to take charge. Doing so is a young man who was the militia's leader in Mogadishu, from the same tribe, the same lineage as Hassan Dahir Wise, and who is a real harsh, tough man. He fought in Afghanistan, he was in Pakistan, he'd been trained to all kinds of guerrillas, even techniques of kidnapping, assassinating, and so on. He took charge of the rest of the country, which caused a huge problem to the said transition government, which actually doesn't govern anything. What happens is, to provide aid, to provide state funds and international funds, the United Nations, the European Union, need a speaker, an interlocutor. And if there's none, it will be the transition government that doesn't govern anything, that becomes the federal government. It's it that is given the money. The money, it's uncertain. There are promises and all, but what is sure is that the worst situation was this. The money from the European community wasn't used to dig wells, as the Somalians say. There's a Somali saying that goes, a milk jug is built from the bottom. Well, they weren't building from the bottom. They went to talk to interlocutors who are relevant enough to cash in the money. There's no other words. And that's what happens. At that moment, the religious movement is overtaken by the most ferocious and the most determined. I talked to you about them, the Takfir. Its foundation is a surah of the Quran. which is more or less interpreted, but that led to it. It's an old movement born from 1771, which has a very harsh vision of a certain understanding of the Holy Scripture, the Holy Muslim Scripture, and it's not shared by everyone. But it says it leaves the door open for this intolerant Islam to take place. It's on that all the movements and the individuals that claim their affiliation are based on. After the explosion of the Alliance for Liberation, a tough group is created in Asmara under the authority of Hassan Daye Owais. In the south, Al-Shabaab have organized themselves. The movements form an alliance. Hezbollah now fights against both Al-Shabaab and Ziamism. They ally and they separate. The two groups merge in 2010 and separate in 2012, and Hezbollah, which is Hassan Daye Owais, fights both the Ziamism that is now deployed, a new mission from the African Union, and Al-Shabaab. The recruitment within Al-Shabaab. As such, you see it coming in 2004. It's a multi-ethnic organization. There are Somalis, of course. They're not the most plentiful. There are Somalis at the grassroots. They're not predominant at the head in the leadership bodies, depending on the region. Some Somalis employed in Iraq and Afghanistan, some Somalis recruited on the spot, sometimes forcefully, children in particular, the ones placed on the front line during fights, and foreign sympathizers that aren't Somalis. And it is what was noticed globally in the USA, who had, as everyone knew, declared war on terrorism. So there were people from Yemen, from Sudan, from the Swahili coast, which is Kenya. All the coast is Muslim, while the inland is Christian. From Bangladesh, everywhere you can imagine, and a Western recruitment within the diaspora, and a few lost ones, as is always the case in the circumstances. This Somali base is not very concerned with the global jihad. Somalis are close people. They lived by themselves. The explosion of Al-Shabaab and of the Islamist movement will come from this fact. We'll get to that in a moment. In 2012, the Al-Shabaab leader pleads allegiance to Al-Qaeda, which doesn't mean much, an allegiance, but it's an allegiance to the idea of a terrorist hypothesis, of a hyper-radical, violent hypothesis that the Muslim belief could create. But this allegiance to Al-Qaeda is due to a leader. The base stays more interested in national affairs, and especially it still functions on a clan rationale. This is why when it comes to Al-Shabaab, you can only speak in a certain geographical area today. There is no coherence, no chief of land staff in Al-Shabaab. There is a spiritual leader, a general leader, who sets the pace because he's the most powerful. And then there are a few small leaders who impose the law on which everyone agrees more or less. So it's difficult. There are a good number of foreign Shababs, very violent, for they are trained, they're not idiots. The two most known are those. They are the instigators of the Mombasa and Amsterdam attacks in Tanzania and Kenya. This one, he's not Somali, but his father is. He was killed in 2013 when Shababs started to destroy each other. This one is a good American from Wisconsin who's a specialist in communications, the internet, and so on. It always comes down in those movements to specialists from Western countries who have strong technical abilities Sometimes there are linguistic skills. Fazul spoke 4 languages. He could walk everywhere. He knew how to disguise himself. He could have worked at a TV network or anywhere else. And then you have women, of course. Samantha, who's called the White Widow, was probably one of the key pieces of the ARESAE university attack. She was educated at the SOAS University in London. She must have taken classes, maybe not those of Lewis, because he's a bit old for that, but of his successor in any case. You can see there the result of her cruelty. Shababs call them themselves the White Widow, so she must have been especially devoted. This is a child, you can see her with the haircut, who has no personal acquaintances with Islam or with Somalia or with the East. Her parents are 2 Brits from the London suburbs where nothing special happens, and all of a sudden there is this triggering factor somewhere that changes everything. I'm almost done, don't worry. So, an obscure internal organization. An advisory council, because we're still in the Somali world. There's a council that deliberates, and a consensus needs to be reached. This advisory council was modeled after the Saudi concept. In 2008, it has 80 members, and there are only about 10 to 15 Somalis among them. That's interesting. Furthermore, a decentralized structure, to answer your earlier question, by regions, we could say, and an organization in one foreign division, a foreign legion, and a national legion. There's a distinction. With a bunch of specialists, some in charge of intelligence, other in charge of the suicide attacks, other in charge of the development of fatwas. Please note that a fatwa isn't a condemnation in Muslim law, it is simply a legal notice given by a person entitled to give it. It can be anything. And a secret service of internal surveillance, the MIA, the security, which observes the Shabaab world from the inside. Basically, general inquiries. That's what it is. The strategy is use of the media, skilled men, at a given point, its own radio, which still works, I think, even its own TV channel when they were in Mogadishu, and manipulation of NGOs. Because the country, as usual, goes through situations relating to geography and terrible climatology. The drought in Somalia, we talk about it when a musician wants to talk about it, but it happens every 2 or 3 years. In 1993, there was one. No, in 1973, there was one much longer than the others, which Somalians called Tabazer, the long queue, because it wouldn't end. It's recurring. Droughts and floods, food shortage, hence the problem they faced, and it was terrible in 93 when I was there. The acquaintances for security reasons between humanitarians and warlords. They needed protection, so they had to pay. It still exists. Al-Shabaab, contrary to what is being said, Al-Shabaab works with NGOs, but it's a very tough trade. If they negotiate with NGOs, it's because they benefit from it. Now, not negotiating with Al-Shabaab when you're in the bushland is very difficult. The situation is very different. The movement has reduced its presence and consequently has less potential from the capital. Iro, you recognize him? It was him who preached the international jihad, the Holy War. A very tough man, he even ended up murdering his own friends. He was killed in 2014, and his successor is him. We don't know much about him. Keep in mind that a mission from the African Union is still deployed in Somalia under a UN mandate. There are 12,000 soldiers out of 20,000 requested. The Kenyan contingent intervened a few years ago. Al-Shabaab, we don't really know, between 5 and 10,000 fighters. That's the Kenyan operation in 2011. They passed the border. There is truly a terrorist threat in Kenya, we know that. In 2013 is when the fracture happens. There are those like Robo, who is a man of the interfleuve whom you can talk to, who at the present time is a refugee, we don't really know where. He was one of the supporters of the Islamic Republic in Somalia, but not on the global scale. Vidani is contested, his former friends are eliminated, and Robo manages to flee but is later captured and imprisoned. The troubles of Al-Shabaab are confirmed and straightened by the Indian Ocean Operation, which has launched since August of 2014, decisive raids on the movement's position. A lot of defections, people joining the government side, which opens a safer window of opportunity for humanitarians. And the death of Shababs during fights against the ARESAE, against the government's army, and terrible fights between them. In 2012, Somalia is supposed to have become stable. About a question earlier, the president is an Aouye from the Bagadir clan, the clan of that general who had conquered Mogadishu in 1991 and who was robbed of his victory by a competitor who was Abgal. The new president, is Abgal, but the Islamist world is a Bagadir, so you have to be very careful. It's not easy for Somalian governments to deal with those Islamists. It's dangerous unless it is to protect them from their own people, but there is always this hypothesis. The major part of the land was taken back from the Islamists. That one was the chief of intelligence. This one on the bottom is a killer. We found photos of him cutting children's throats, stoning women, and so on. That is a table of the construction of Somalian Islamism. You can consult in on your PowerPoints. All of that, of course, is not very pleasant. But you have to remember that Islam is also something else, and remember that Somalis are also something else. They're not a people lost in the depth of a scorching wasteland. They're also very peaceful. I myself lived mostly in the desert, and it's superb. How do you analyze the evolution of Al-Shabaab, in particular relating to attacks in other countries? First of all, I don't live in the past. But if I did insist that much on the history, it's because you cannot have a clear idea, a forecast, an expectation of what can happen by knowing a number of facts. A knowledge of fundamental Islam, a knowledge of the Islamist trends, a knowledge of the Somali society, not by the variety of all his clans, that's not your thing, but to understand, well, that everything starts from the base and goes up depending on the context. So, the future. The future is all the more difficult to determine that for now is for sure there's a regression. There's a regression that's the result of this cleavage between the two perceptions of Al-Shabaab, those who fight for a global Islam that could reach Port de Clichy tomorrow, and those who simply want an order to be established in their country, Somalia, based on the Muslim law. The Muslim law, they either establish it from a restricted Islam, for example, the one in Saudi Arabia, where the people are led by their princes, or a more enlightened Islam. You have republics like Mauritania, which I know well, where there's no major history, even though sometimes there can be things that shock us. The future, I think we are presently at a crossroads. We need to observe if those two trends of Islam will find a reconciliation, which is if the government in place will try to retrieve Hassan Dayo ways, or if the Shababs will rearrange themselves around their strictest wing. I showed you the picture earlier. Those are really extraordinarily dangerous people. They are people who are actually assassins. Who don't know. They don't do it on purpose, but they're closer to serial killers than to people having a serious political conviction. It's actually really close to the average German citizen who all of a sudden found himself torturing people. Let's not forget that we've known similar things in the West. But I don't really have an answer, other than telling you we're at a crossroads, and above all to observe which trend will establish itself. After that, it also has a lot to do with international politics, if the Americans keep on striking or if we start doing something else and digging wells. There a risk that Al-Shabaab joins ISIS by pledging allegiance to them. It's kind of done already, but we must see who we're talking about. Is there a risk of a leap forwards? Definitely. But a leap forwards can also not work. Most times it doesn't work. So joining ISIS, we're not at the same level. ISIS is an American creation. After having destroyed Iraq and all state structures, which in my opinion must be avoided at all costs in Syria, there were a lot of people from the intelligence and from the structure who wanted revenge. This is not the case here. Most Shababs are for sure people who want to achieve an Islamist Republic of Somalia, who don't want to get into the global jihad. Now, it is the glorious uncertainty of poker. It's going to be about the way political leaders will deal with that, which means international politics with a focused generosity will not only bribe the people established in power, but will try to extend its action to the villages, and you'll have a huge role to play, by the way. But that's what it's about. Now, explicitly joining ISIS, they're starving the Shababs. The others are managers, a lot of senior executives who know how to manipulate people. They're much more fearsome. What kind of support can Al-Shabaab obtain from the population? Nothing can be done in Somalia if it's not based on Islam, that's for sure. But you have to know which Islam, because Islam is multifaceted. There is indeed a political, radical Islam. It's Al-Shabaab or Hizbul Islam with Hassan Dair Owais. But there are also peaceful Muslim movements which are traditional but become politicized because it's 2015 and it's not like 50 or 30 years ago. There are in Somalia and Islam things that can serve as a basis. It's a Muslim population, but I think that it has suffered a lot from its Arabization. Had it kept its Somali identity, and maybe they want it back, it's not to be excluded, and to recapture a true Somali Islam. You know, I've lived a very long time in the bushland among Somalis, and everyone was devout, peacefully devout. There were circumstances of the African geopolitics in the 90s, 2000s, which have upset everything. The fall of the Berlin Wall hasn't had good effects on international peace. The assassination of Saddam Hussein, certainly the international morale gained from it, but the Iraqi, I'm not so sure. So there are many things to reflect on, but in Somalia, a peaceful Islam exists, and even among the Islamists, there are people, Sharif, for instance, he's a man with whom you can discuss. I've met him. He's not a stupid man like you can find in Boko Haram or elsewhere.